There's a wind that drifts over the Atacama Desert, like an old sigh, too dry to move sand, but just strong enough to stir memory. The light here is pale and distant, and even the bones seem to wait for something, though no one quite knows what. You might think this place is empty, but it is not. The desert remembers. In this ancient fishing society, death was not a moment. It was a process, a continuation, a slow unwinding of self through layers of salt, red ochre, and time. Along the northern fringe of Chile, where salt-crusted cliffs lean into a flat blue sky, people once lived in ways that feel both strangely familiar and impossibly far. Their homes were simple, driftwood shelters beside cold beaches, nets laid out to dry in the sun, fires fed by sea wrack and brine. Many of the Chinchorro mummies appear to have their mouths wide open, stretched in what looks like permanent agony. Their faces are frozen, tilted skyward, as if they saw something no one else could, and shouted into the desert silence. And beside them, wrapped in reeds or dressed in clay, the dead. Some are painted a deep, glossy black with manganese paste. Others are red and rusted like old iron. Still others are pale and clay-like, almost ghostly in appearance. They do not lie in coffins or tombs. They sit, they stare, and often they scream. Not buried, not burned, but present, sitting quietly near the cooking pot or propped gently in the sleeping corner, as if waiting for morning. Long before the pyramids rose in Egypt, before Athens debated its first law, or Babylon etched stone with its rules, families here were already practicing something older than religion, the long, deliberate work of caring for the dead. The Chinchorro people, that's the name archaeologists gave them, left behind thousands of carefully preserved human remains. We'll step softly into the homes where the dead still lingered, and where children may have grown up under the watchful gaze of a long-departed mother or uncle. We'll explore the rituals of red paint, bone removal, and the mystery of the wide-open mouths. And we'll stay for a while, in the calm sadness of time slowly forgotten. This is not a metaphor. What were they saying? Tonight, we'll drift backward, through dust and salt, through fire and ritual, to explore this quiet, sun-baked world. This is deep history for sleepers. If you're still listening later, I'd love to know what part stayed with you. Let us begin where life never really ended, in the quiet homes of the living and the dead. A mummy in every hut, you wake slowly, to a world where nothing moves too quickly. The light comes in not as a bright flare, but as a pale haze, slipping in through the seams of a wall made of reeds and driftwood. The walls creak gently, not from wind, but from the coolness of early morning, loosening the night stillness. You don't remember falling asleep, not exactly. It's just that the day slowly drifted into dark, and now it is drifting back. You can hear the ocean, not loudly, not crashing, just a low, distant pulse, like breath pressed through a long tunnel. Somewhere above the sound of waves, there are birds calling, soft whistles, broken by the occasional high note. The kind of birds that always sound slightly bored, the kind that stay, but they left behind something older and, in a way, more personal. The most ancient tradition of mummification known to us. They preserved their loved ones not for glory, not for ceremony, but to keep them close. They didn't build mausoleums. They made room in the home. You turn your head. They sit. They lean. Their heads tilt just slightly. Their mouths, often open, seem to imply something in between a word and a breath. The sands are full of salt and minerals that pull moisture away from the body. Early on, they removed the skin and organs, then reinforced the skeleton and rebuilt the flesh with paste and reeds. Later, they began mummifying by drying the whole body and painting it. There were variations: black mummies, red mummies, mud-coated mummies. Each type seemed to correspond to a different era, or perhaps a different philosophy. But the goal remained: presence, continuity, the slow, loving maintenance of those who had passed. But the Chinchorro did not leave preservation to chance. They improved upon nature. They invented mummification before anyone else did. The hut creaks softly as the wind picks up outside, just enough to make the reeds shiver. Beside the wall near the door, your brother's form rests under a woven mat. He was always the lightest sleeper. In the middle of the hut, the fire has died down. Its coals are gray, curled like dried leaves. You stir them with a stick. The child you lost, the father who coughed too much, the mother who slipped beneath a wave, they are still here. Their bodies strengthened with ash and bone splints. Their faces redone with soft hands. Their silence folded gently into the rhythms of your days. And lay a few dry reeds across the top. A thin trail of smoke begins to rise. You hear a neighbor's voice, low and tired. Nets are being checked, knives sharpened. A baby cries and is soothed. All the while, inside these homes, the dead remain. Watching, waiting, not to frighten, but to remind, to remember, to hold the space between breaths. The figure near the wall does not move. Her mouth is still open. Her painted face is slightly chipped. But there is no decay, no rot, just stillness, just presence. She has been with you since before you could walk. You remember her being redressed one season, when the fabric had started to tear. Your mother smoothed the clay on her nose again, humming softly. She was always good at noses. Centuries before the first dynasty in Egypt. Thousands of years before the great tombs. Their faces are masks, sculpted from clay and pigment, yet strangely expressive. The gulls call again. The mummies do not answer. There are hundreds of them, each one a little different. For the Chinchorro, death was more like a soft transition, a pause in activity rather than a disappearance. The dead were never really gone. They were simply quieter. Not the silence of loss, but the hush of something ancient that hasn't finished speaking. You see tiny mummies, no bigger than a cat, painted with the same care as the adults. You see infants, fetuses even, swaddled and masked. The Chinchorro mummified their young, perhaps more than anyone else. Some believe it was a way of grieving. Others think it was about honoring potential. In either case, it speaks of a worldview that did not divide life and death as sharply as we do. Still present, still watching. And they weren't made for show. They weren't sealed away. They were part of the household, everyday companions to the living. You didn't set fire to the body and scatter the ashes. It was memory made visible. It was the rhythm of life and death, kept in the same breath, in the same room. You can imagine sitting on the floor beside your brother's still form, holding his hand one last time before beginning. You can imagine the quiet focus of cutting, scraping, wrapping, not with fear or disgust, but with calm, practiced hands. There was nothing morbid here. Perhaps even disputes were settled with a glance toward their stillness. They weren't relics. They weren't haunted. They were still part of the family's arrangement. Death wasn't a final event. It was a new phase of care. Just as you fed him when he was young, now you watched over him in this next stage. Instead, you began a long and careful process, not to let them go, but to keep them. You removed what was soft and would spoil. You strengthened what remained. You padded the inside with reeds or ash, stitched the skin, or applied a new layer. You shaped their face with clay and painted it red or black. Then you welcomed them home again. The floor is dry and packed hard beneath your cheek. It smells faintly of salt, of old ash, of the thin desert dust that seems to settle everywhere. You lie still for a moment. You know better than to rise too quickly. In this place, everything is slower. Your breath moves gently. The air is cool but not cold, dry but not harsh. You've learned to listen before moving. And today, like every day, the silence is full of presence. There, at the edge of your vision, is a figure sitting by the wall. She's always been there. Wrapped in worn fabric, her limbs reinforced with thin sticks, her face coated in the dull, soft sheen of red clay. But she is not absent either. She is family. Her mouth is open. Not shouting, not moaning, just open. Her eyes are shut, or perhaps faded. It is a life, one that unfolded over thousands of years, in a desert older than history. This is how people lived along the northern coast of Chile, in one of the driest deserts in the world. Long before cities, before pyramids, before writing carved its way into clay. They fished the Pacific. They gathered shellfish. They made homes out of wood and grass. And they never said goodbye to the dead. Her head is tilted at a soft angle, as though she's listening, as though something caught her attention long ago, and she's still waiting for the answer. She is not alive. This is not a scene from a story or a dream. You are among the Chinchorro now. They were not kings or builders. They did not leave towering monuments or epic poems. When someone died, you didn't lay them in a grave and walk away. There is no way to truly know how this felt. But you can imagine. The figures left behind by the Chinchorro don't lie flat with arms crossed. Children grew up under their gaze. Meals were cooked and eaten beside them. Stories were told in their presence. The desert helped preserve them. The Atacama is dry, so dry that nothing rots quickly. Over time, their methods changed. In our modern thinking, death is an absence, a hole, a gap in the rhythm of life. When you walk through one of their ancient settlements, or through the museum cases that now house many of their dead, you feel that quiet. The idea of a mummy in every hut may sound strange, perhaps even disturbing to our modern sensibilities. But to them, it was the opposite of fear. They did not fear the dead. They cared for them. You rise slowly, the blanket still around your shoulders. You move past her gently, not out of fear, but out of habit. You don't want to wake the others. You sit beside the warmth and breathe. Outside, the morning is coming fully now. The air smells of sea brine and dust. They never do. But that doesn't mean they're gone. To be among the Chinchorro is to share space with time itself, to live in a world where nothing truly leaves. Everything remains. Outside, others are rising too. And as the sun edges up past the horizon, you know that you are not alone. You never have been. Not really. Not here. Watching over the living in the Chinchorro world, the line between living and dead was drawn in soft sand. It shifted. It blurred. There was no moment of finality, no curtain dropping with the hush of grief. Death was a slow rearrangement, a change of roles, not of place. The air becomes heavy with unspoken things, not just grief, but the gentle gathering of memory. And then the work begins. You didn't disappear. You stayed, quietly, and someone made sure you were whole. Her limbs will be wrapped in cloth to preserve them from the air, and in the days that follow, her flesh will be carefully removed, not violently, but piece by piece, as if shedding a layer that no longer fits. Maybe in the corner where she used to mend nets. Maybe near the hearth, where her voice once read songs to children. Her presence will not be haunting. It will be comforting. The family will adjust to the silence. And in the stillness of the night, as the fire crackled low, a child might ask a question aloud, not to a living parent, because the presence was real. The presence was still listening. But to the shape that sat silently in the corner, its mouth open tilted skyward. We tend to hide our dead, to put them in far-off places, to speak of them in past tense, to keep them apart from the texture of the daily. Families may have revisited their ancestors in times of crisis, of joy, or simply as part of seasonal routine. These were people who believed that remembering was an act of labor, that care did not end when the body cooled. There's a low fire in the center, its smoke trickling through the reed walls and out into the high, dry air. wrapped, painted, eyes closed or faintly drawn, mouths open in that signature curve. They are family, a grandmother, an uncle, a sister, gone in the second year of life, and a boy, small, painted in red, arms crossed not in rigidity, but in rest. They do not interrupt, but they are present. Nets hang near the ceiling, drying slowly. A child lies curled on a woven mat, thumb in mouth, breathing soft. A woman, older, sits cross-legged, mending a piece of leather. She hums something, an old song, maybe, the kind with no words. And all the while, beneath a thin blanket of sky, the living and the dead keep their quiet company. That family was a circle which didn't break easily. The dead were not static. They could be maintained, adapted. She adjusts a strip of cloth that's come loose, smoothing it over the shoulder. She whispers something you can't hear. Then she returns to her mat and lies down. Their silence wasn't permanent. It was a shared agreement. But the Chinchorro chose differently. They chose to keep them close. And not just the honored elders or revered leaders, but everyone. Every child, every infant, every tiny life was given this same labor of care. And in time, the silence will become part of the rhythm. Not just that they exist, not just that they're old, but that they're so inclusive. In many cultures, such early deaths might be mourned, but quickly moved on from, especially in harsh environments where survival is uncertain. But the Chinchorro did not dismiss these lives. They preserved them with the same intricate rituals and delicate effort, as if to say, you were here, and you are still part of us. The bones once bare will be strengthened. Reeds will be slipped alongside her spine, thin rods to hold her upright. It would feel like being held in the soft web of time, a time that loops gently, that repeats, that never ends completely. A time where everyone is still here. It shaped the space of the home, which was never just for the living. It shaped the structure of family, where roles could endure long past breath. It shaped the very concept of presence, of who is here, and who is simply quieter now. Ash and wool will be packed inside the empty spaces. Her skin, or a replacement made from hide or fabric, will be sewn back into place. A nose will be shaped from clay, eyes painted with care. And at the end, she will look almost like herself again. Not truly alive, but not gone. You can almost picture how it might begin. A man comes home from the shore, his face wine-burned, arms scraped from hauling nets. The fish were fewer today, the water too quiet. He calls to his wife, but she does not answer. A way of refusing to let the dead fall away too quickly? In our modern world, death comes with a flurry of paperwork, of polished wood and white sheets, of names engraved on distant stone. For the Chinchorro, death came with thread, with red pigment, with the memory of a laugh, smoothed gently into clay. She lies still, breathless, her eyes half-lidded. Around her, the smell of firewood and old salt. He kneels beside her and waits. For a time, he just watches. There is no panic, no screaming, just silence and wind. Later, others come. A cousin, an elder, a neighbor. The hut grows dim with bodies and with dusk. Her body will be washed with seawater, cold and clean. You might think of this as primitive. You might see it as strange. But what if, instead, it's a form of continuity? And so, once her form is restored, she will come home. She will not be placed in a tomb. She will not be burned or buried. She will be seated, somewhere quiet, somewhere familiar. This practice, this patient and reverent care for the dead, shaped every part of Chinchorro life. Many homes likely had more than one mummy. An elder, a child, a sibling. Some may have had entire generations seated near one another, and the parent might not shush them. To modern archaeologists, this integration of death and life feels radical. This is one of the most striking things about the Chinchorro mummies. The youngest known Chinchorro mummies are fetuses, babies who died before they even took a breath. This care extended across time and space. Some mummies appear to have been rewrapped, repainted, even restructured years after their initial preservation. There is something deeply tender about this. Not sentimental, not decorative, but tender in the way of worn hands and soft cloth. You imagine now the inside of a Chinchorro shelter, not one in a museum, not excavated and labeled, but full and warm and lived in. And there, along the wall, 4 shapes sit quietly. When the woman finishes her mending, she stands, stretches, and walks to one of the figures. The fire flickers. The mummies watch, and the house remains whole. To sleep in such a place would not be terrifying. Outside, the world shifts. Wind glides across the sand, leaving no trace. The stars emerge, clear and sharp. The air cools to the bone. The household ritual, even in the smallest things. A reed basket, a piece of knotted twine, a strip of salt-cured fish. The Chinchorro world was shaped by a kind of rhythm. Not the rhythm of machines or bells or marked time, but of waves and light and breath. Each day began not with urgency, but with noticing. The ocean was their clock. The tide was their calendar. You see the thin lines of smoke beginning to rise. The low silhouettes of figures beginning their work. Someone is sharpening a fishhook with a flake of stone. Someone else is mending a net, her hands moving with practiced ease. But the term assemblage misses something. These were not items stored. They were relationships maintained. A group of figures sitting together did not form a collection. They formed a family. A child runs past, barefoot and laughing, her voice the only sharp sound in the morning air. Even the positioning sometimes changed. One mummy, found in a seated pose with legs crossed, had been adjusted into that position long after initial mummification. This wasn't neglect. It was ongoing care. You don't catch the words. They're not for you. The act of addressing the dead, greeting them, offering them small tokens, including them in ritual meals, may have served not only to honor memory, but to reinforce the living's connection to the past. Anthropologists refer to this as ancestor veneration. But again, the term feels too formal. Life here required skill, but also resilience. And perhaps the presence of the dead offered something deeper than comfort. Perhaps they reminded the living that life, too, is temporary, but not meaningless. That hands once gone can still shape the days that follow. That even in silence, the dead offer company. This isn't ceremony, it's habit. It's pattern. It's care. Fish are drying. Tools have been cleaned and stored. Children play near the cliffs. You do not speak. You don't need to. The sound of the sea is enough. Some of them pause beside a seated figure, a small one, maybe a sister or cousin, and place a shell near her feet, not as a gift, but as a game, a way of including her, the way they always have. The sun is high, and the shadows have withdrawn into tight pools. Outside, the ocean glitters, too bright to look at directly. The salt hangs in the air like a haze. You hear the calls of other villagers. Someone is singing an old melody, without instruments, voice only. It drifts across the sand like a bird looking for a place to land. And inside their homes, where death was never far, memory moved like the tide too, returning, withdrawing, returning again. Infants whose skulls were too soft to support even basic structure were wrapped in tighter bundles, and their facial masks shaped with extra clay for strength. You gather the dried fish from the hooks near the entrance and soak them briefly in water warmed over the fire. Your grandmother. Her mask has faded over the years, but her shoulders still hold their curve. Behind you, a figure in the corner remains still. You have the repetition of tasks that form the pattern of your days. And in that repetition, Something else is preserved, not just bodies, but a way of being. A way of understanding time as something that circles, gently and endlessly. Her mouth remains open, as it always is, shaped like surprise, or sorrow, or perhaps nothing at all. You don't really know. But sometimes in the moments when you're alone, and the wind has dropped, you imagine you can hear breath just barely moving through that silence. A whisper that doesn't quite form a word. Her head is angled just slightly left, toward the doorway, as though waiting for someone. You know it's not necessary, this third portion, but you do it anyway. You grind dried seaweed into fine flakes with a flat stone. You break open a pod of salt pods, crystalline deposits gathered from near the river mouth. Every motion is quiet, repetitive, almost meditative. There is no rush. Hunger, here, is slow and familiar, and so is sharing. In some, even tiny decorative elements were added. Beads, red threads, bits of shell. These were not rituals of grandeur. They were small, persistent affirmations. You mattered. It's morning again. You wake slowly, as you always do. The hut is quiet. Light filters through the reeds in pale threads. Others were moved between households, depending on season or need. But they were never discarded, never forgotten. They were integrated. They had a place. Dust floats, unmoving, suspended in the golden stillness. There is no need for noise. The rhythm of daily tasks is a quiet one. You brush the floor with a bundle of dried twigs. You sift the ashes in the hearth and add new kindling. You step outside and gather more reeds from the drying rack, careful not to startle the gulls that sit like judges on the nearby rocks. They always look like they're about to speak, and never do. Beside the hearth, the fire has burned itself out. The coals remain faintly warm, like stones left in the sun. You sit up and stretch, your limbs stiff from sleep, and pull your wrap tighter around your shoulders. Across from you, your grandmother sits as she always has. Her mouth is open. Her posture leans forward just slightly, as if still listening. You nod to her, almost without thinking. You rise and move through your morning, like water moving around stones. You're not alone. Around you, other homes are waking too. And in every home, like yours, there is someone who is no longer breathing, but who is still present. Not every mummy sat out in plain view. Some were wrapped and stored gently behind mats or partitions. Anthropologists who've studied the Chinchorro often speak of mummy assemblages, groups of preserved individuals, sometimes found clustered together in homes or shallow sand-covered spaces. There are signs that these mummies were handled over time, repaired, adjusted, a broken arm reinforced with new sticks, a flaking layer of red pigment reapplied carefully. And that care was not confined to adults. The smallest mummies often show the most delicate workmanship. You begin preparing food, a task that always starts with rhythm. You set out 3 portions, one for yourself, one for your sister, and one for the quiet figure in the corner. When your sister returns, she does the same. She pauses near your grandmother, touches her shoulder lightly, and murmurs a greeting. This kind of gesture is not rare. In fact, it may have been common practice. And patterns have power. The Chinchorro lived in a landscape that was difficult. Harsh sun, little water, constant wind. It's midday now. You step out, blinking into the light. Your people have no writing, no written name for the dead. But you have gestures. You have paint. It's late afternoon now. The sun leans low. You've finished your work for the day. And as dusk comes on, as the wind picks up and the salt dries white along the edge of the hut, you sit beside the fire once more. And across the room, the red-painted face of your grandmother remains in shadow, her presence folding softly into the dark. She is here. She has always been here. And so are you. There is a kind of waiting that lives deep in desert places. It's not the tense anticipation of something arriving. nor the dull patience of something delayed. A child might sit cross-legged beside the low wall, watching how the sun slipped along their mother. Sleeping face, the same face she'd worn when she lived, but now stiff with clay and threaded with delicate stitching. Her form had long since stilled, but her presence hadn't. There were no trees to catch it, no leaves to rustle. They didn't seal their dead away, or avoid speaking of them. They didn't view corpses as something corrupting or untouchable. Instead, they treated death as another stage of life, fragile, yes, and sacred, but also familiar. They mended their dead. They repainted them. They touched them. Just the low moan of air slipping between dunes and over rocks. In many later cultures, the dead are honored, yes, but also removed, buried in distant places, separated by ceremony. But here, they were woven back into daily life. You didn't need to remember someone who had died. You could simply look across the room and see them, still present, still watching, still with you. A cracked skull had been reinforced with clay. A sunken rib cage had been gently padded with soft ash. These repairs weren't hurried. They were careful, intimate. They began the work. The long, slow act of unmaking and remaking. Flesh softened, then stripped. Bones cleaned, dried, braced with wood. Ash poured gently into the empty places. Clay pressed into mouths, reshaping voices that no longer spoke. Skin laid carefully, piece by piece, like paper stretched across memory. New ones are still being found, tucked beneath ancient layers of dust and stone, some curled in woven wraps, others upright in sand pits. The colors weren't decorative. They were part of the ritual. They marked eras, traditions, changes in technique. Over time, the methods evolved, but the meaning stayed. And the wind moving slowly over dust, that love stayed. It settled in the clay. It drifted through the walls. It remained, long after names had vanished, long after huts had crumbled, long after the last Chinchorro breath was drawn. Some are just bones now. Others still bear traces of pigment. Red ochre, black manganese, white clay, mouths still open, as if trying to say something too old to hear. And through it all, the long, slow hush of time, holding them, holding us, holding silence. Somewhere remnants of seaweed cloaks, or hair combed into thick mats. A few still seem to look directly at you, as if time had no urgency here, only the need to remain near. Far off, seabirds might call out, a thin, distant sound that echoed like memory. And underfoot, the desert itself held traces of all that had come before. They were part of ordinary life. They sat quietly near sleeping mats. They leaned against woven walls. They sometimes even traveled with their families, moved from hut to hut, season to season. Wherever the living went, the dead could come too. Thousands of years of footsteps, bones, campfires, salt. Time didn't separate people. It simply layered them. A baby who lived for only a day might still rest beside her aging uncle. A grandfather might outlive 3 wives, and all of them might remain together long after breath had stopped. The Chinchorro world was not divided by death. It was extended by it. The child might hum softly while tying bundles of dried fish, or plait lengths of seagrass for nets, or help stir the pot of boiling mussels, all with her nearby. Not in a grave, not in memory, but in the room. It's slower than that, older than that, the kind of waiting that isn't about anything in particular, just the stillness that happens when nothing interrupts. In the homes of the ancient Chinchorro, that stillness was almost a companion. It hung between mats and bodies, between woven nets and painted skulls, between the tides rise and fall. A long, dry silence you learned to live alongside, like you would an aunt or a grandfather who never said much, but never really left either. The day moved gently here, not fast enough to count hours, but slow enough to notice shadows. Chinchorro society had no kings, no chieftains, no towering monuments. There were no grand speeches carved in stone, no record of laws or conquests. It was quiet, collective, and continuous. And the dead were part of that continuity. They didn't dominate the living, but neither were they separate. Their presence was part of the family rhythm, like siblings who had aged differently, but never really gone. You can imagine an evening when the fire burned low and children played near the doorway, while their grandmother, who'd passed years before, leaned ever so slightly in her reed bindings, watching. Her posture wasn't stiff, not really. She might have tilted as the earth softened, or from the breeze slipping through the hut's split walls. Her mouth still gaped softly, its edges darkened with centuries of pigment, and her hair, once long and thick, had thinned, but held the faintest traces of salt and sun. No one spoke of her with dread. She was still part of the room's warmth. Outside, the wind moved across the dry sand with a slow, scratchy breath. The Chinchorro didn't seem to fear death in the way many later cultures did. In one excavation, archaeologists discovered mummies who had been carefully patched. It's hard to say how many mummies there were, and yet they weren't meant for display. They weren't arranged for admiration or awe. This continuity blurred the line between past and present. There's something profoundly human in that, and profoundly rare. And when the time came for someone else to pass, the community did not panic or retreat. Some were painted in deep red, others black, a few later in pale earth tones. There was love in every step, the kind of love that lingers after breath, the kind that shapes silence into presence. And in the quiet corners of those homes, with the sea outside, what remains now are echoes, bones bound in reeds, faces that still hold shape. The screaming mummies of northern Chile. Why are their mouths open like that? We now begin to gently shift focus from daily life to the strange and haunting physicality of the Chinchorro dead, and the mysteries that cling to their final expressions. There's a particular kind of silence that lives in the desert, not the silence of emptiness, but one shaped by wind and memory. It's the hush that settles after something has passed, but still lingers. And when you move slowly, softly, across the Atacama's old riverbeds and dry, salt-crusted dunes, that silence seems to deepen. It isn't empty, it's watchful. Among the Chinchorro mummies, this feeling intensifies, not because they were buried in grand tombs or surrounded by treasure, not because of dramatic myths or frightening curses, but because of the mouths, the way they gape, not wide, not twisted, but slack and open, quietly parted, as though caught just at the edge of speech, or breath, or grief. You notice it again and again, across dozens of preserved faces, blackened by time or painted in ochre, thin lips curled slightly inward, the jaw often unhinged, no longer bound shut. It's subtle at first, but once you begin to see it, you can't stop seeing it. That strange, open quiet. Archaeologists call them screaming mummies, though the term isn't quite right. These faces don't scream, they don't strain. They aren't frozen in horror or pain. Instead, their mouths suggest something gentler. An unfinished exhale, a sigh, a long-held thought slipping away into the dust. And yet the question remains, why are they like this? It's not just one or two. It's not a rare accident of decay. Across hundreds of Chinchorro remains, this feature recurs. And not just with the same technique, or within the same time period. Even as mummification practices changed, from black to red to natural, the open mouths continued. This wasn't an oversight. It seems to have been a choice, or perhaps a ritual necessity. One theory points to the drying process. In the Chinchorro method, bodies were often carefully stripped of soft tissue and reconstructed, bones reinforced with sticks, cavities filled with ash or wool, skin reapplied, then coated in clay. During drying, the jaw may have slackened. Without modern embalming, this is expected. And yet, the rest of the body was so deliberately composed, so attentively shaped. Why leave the mouth? Some scholars suggest the jaw was intentionally left loose as part of a belief system. Perhaps the mouth was meant to remain open, to allow the soul to move freely, to let breath exit, to release spirit. There are parallels in other ancient cultures, where the mouth was opened after death to ensure communication with ancestors or the gods. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, performed an opening of the mouth ritual to allow the deceased to speak and eat in the afterlife. But the Chinchorro weren't Egyptians. They didn't write down their beliefs. There are no tomb inscriptions or detailed texts. Only bodies. Silent, open-mouthed bodies. Another possibility is that the mouth's openness signaled a kind of liminality, a state between living and dead. Not entirely gone, not entirely here. Suspended. The mouth might have been seen as a threshold, a place where breath meets world. By leaving it open, perhaps they acknowledged that threshold. They kept it ajar. Or maybe it was simply an aesthetic preference. A way of portraying the dead not as tightly sealed, but softened. Relatable, still slightly animate. The Chinchorro did not hide their mummies. These were not hidden beneath ground or stone. They lived among them, touched them, repainted them. Perhaps the open mouth made the face feel more peaceful, less gone. The paradox is this: the more you study their silence, the louder it feels. You find yourself leaning in, almost expecting sound. The mummies' mouths do not shout, but they invite. You begin to wonder what they were trying to tell us, what they saw, what they endured, and what they never had the chance to finish saying. Scientists, of course, look for patterns. Some note that the positioning of certain mummies suggests post-mortem shifting, that bodies dry unevenly, that ligaments shrink, that gravity plays its part, that the gaping mouth is no mystery, merely a function of decay and time. And there's truth in that. Bodies change, and not all of them were perfectly preserved. But here's what complicates that view. Many of the Chinchorro mummies weren't natural corpses, passively decaying. They were reconstructed. Their limbs were reset. Their faces were molded with clay, eyes painted on, noses carved from ash. If they had wanted to seal the mouths, they could have. They did everything else with great precision. Why not this? One particularly striking mummy, now stored in a temperature-controlled lab, shows the jaw braced by a thin reed splint, delicately inserted where muscle would have been. The upper and lower teeth still visible, coated in fine ochre dust. The splint didn't close the mouth. It supported it, slightly open, slightly forward, as if holding a pose. In another, the skin around the mouth is reinforced with clay and plant fiber, carefully packed in layers. There's no sign of trauma, no struggle, just a kind of serene openness. A calmness that is both comforting and strange. Like someone caught just before a word was spoken, or in the middle of a long, slow breath. There's an unsettling intimacy in that. We are not used to faces like this. Modern death is often clinical, hidden, polished, sealed. Mouths are closed, eyes are shut. Bodies are made to look finished, at rest. But these ancient faces don't seem finished. They seem paused, still partway here. The effect becomes even more poignant when you remember that many of these mummies were children, toddlers with soft, curling hair, infants wrapped in seaweed nets. Their mouths open not in horror, but in something gentler. An innocence preserved not just in form, but in expression. Some are barely more than skeletons, yet their faces still hold that soft vacancy. If you sit quietly in one of the small desert museums, the kind with low lighting and thin wooden benches, you might find yourself staring for too long. The air is dry. The glass is fogged in places, and behind the glass, the faces wait. Not looking at you exactly, but not looking away either. That openness becomes a kind of mirror, a space where your thoughts begin to echo. You feel your own breath more clearly, the way it moves in, and out, and in again. There are no definitive answers. No carved tablets, no mythological scrolls to guide us. Only remains, softly gaping, gently posed, tended with a patience we barely understand. And perhaps that's the point. The mystery isn't there to be solved. It's there to be sat with, like the Chinchorro once sat with their dead, like the child who once slept beside her mummified brother, like the wind that moves slowly through the dunes, brushing against mouths that haven't spoken in 7,000 years, but still seem to whisper. The first thing people notice always is the mouth, that dry, hollow oval that stretches the lower jaw into something both human and inhuman at once. Was it wind or gravity, or the subtle shift of sinew and bone as flesh gave way to dust? Scientists have asked this too, again and again. The mummies of the Atacama, especially the oldest ones, the Chinchorro, are often found with mouths frozen open, as if gasping. But when you listen long enough, they begin to trail off into mystery. The Atacama is the driest desert on Earth, and it doesn't forget the dead. The wind smooths, but it doesn't bury. It uncovers quietly. Bones surface slowly, a finger here, a cheekbone there. Time doesn't rot things here, it reveals them. In such a place, the open mouth becomes not just a physical trait, but a symbol. A long exhale over centuries. The breath of a people who are never truly gone. Because some of these faces look too sculpted, too exact. Not everything that looks like a scream is a scream. Sometimes it's just the shape silence makes when it waits too long. Because that's where they often were, in homes. Not buried away, not hidden. A father kept by the hearth. That the open mouths weren't just aesthetic or symbolic, but functional. Part of a belief that the dead could speak, could relay messages, could carry dreams or warnings or wisdom. Others speak of fear, that the dead had to be kept close, had to be watched, had to be contained, and that the open mouth was a sign of a soul trying to leave or trying to stay. A grandmother by the door, the mouth open like it might speak again, like it was still listening. And maybe it was. Maybe a mother opened her childless mouth and left it that way so she wouldn't forget the sound of his laugh. The Chinchorro left no books, no scrolls, no glyphs. Their language vanished long ago. All that's left are bodies and mouths. So we guess, we project. We stare back into those empty faces and try to see meaning. But the truth is quieter than we want it to be. Sometimes it's just how the bones fall. Or maybe a husband shaped his wife's face to remember her stories. Maybe the mouth is not screaming at all. Maybe it's singing or praying. After all, the Chinchorro didn't see the dead as past. They saw them as paused, continuing, unfinished. The tension in the jaw, it wasn't always natural. Not because it's grotesque, not because it's frightening, but because it refuses to be ignored. It invites you to sit down beside it, to consider your own body, your own breath, your own slow inching toward whatever comes after. It doesn't ask for fear. It asks for presence. It was guided, wired, held open on purpose, perhaps to show that the soul was still mid-breath, that it hadn't quite left yet. Sometimes the eyelids are peeled back too, giving them a wide-eyed, haunted look. But you learn quickly that the Chinchorro were deliberate in all things. These were not careless deaths. These were not quick burials. These were engineered remains. It looks like a scream, the kind that never ended, like a soul was caught in the moment. It tried to speak and never finished. With bone and reeds, with the tightness of wrappings or the angle of the skull, they shaped the dead into something more than dead. A memory, perhaps, or a messenger, or simply a presence that had to remain in the room. But as you stand there, looking at the ancient face, time collapses just a little. The ones whose mouths are closed, they're fewer. Often it's the naturally mummified ones, the ones not deliberately altered. Or the later ones, once the elaborate embalming traditions had begun to fade. But the oldest mummies, the red ones, the black ones, they're the ones who watch you with that hollow, voiceless gape. And it changes the whole feeling of death. It makes it less still, less silent. Death becomes something ongoing, something halfway done. The scream isn't loud. It's not even there. It's just open. And it's been open for thousands of years. You begin to wonder, was it pain? Was it ritual? The mouth may be open, not because the person died in fear or agony, but because someone, long after death, made it that way. You start to notice a pattern. The anthropologists use clinical words. They speak of mandibular disarticulation, of decomposition gases, of mummification angles. The desert plays its part too. You can imagine, maybe, a child sitting across from one of these mummies in their home. Some theories speak of communication. Still others suggest it's grief turned into sculpture. The body shaped by those left behind. Mourning made visible. There are no written records to explain it. Still, once you've seen a Chinchorro mummy's face, it stays with you. And maybe that's what the mouth is for. To remind the living to stay open, to keep listening, to keep wondering. The longer you sit with them, these ancient, open-mouthed faces, the more familiar they become. Not friendly, exactly. Not comforting in any traditional sense. But something quieter than that. As though they've been waiting, without demand or impatience, for someone to simply sit still long enough to be present with them. These weren't meant to be passed over quickly. They ask for slowness, for stillness, for repetition. And the desert gives them that in abundance. Sometimes the open mouths are slightly crooked, tilting a little to one side, as though the wind caught the final exhale and turned it gently. Other times, the lips are puckered in strange, pursed shapes, like the beginning of a word, that they were symbolic of passage. A place where the breath could go in and out, even after life had gone. That the soul wasn't sealed in, but allowed to move, to come and go, to linger near those it loved. Their ideas of death were more porous, more communal. To die wasn't to disappear, it was to shift. You didn't go somewhere else. You stayed, but changed. You became still, but not absent. And so the face had to stay expressive, had to carry something more than silence. The Chinchorro, after all, believed in balance, in movement, in keeping the cycle open. A mouth open not in horror, but in process. The process of becoming part of the earth again, of becoming a story told by others. Her grief is heavy, but her fingers work slowly, lovingly. But what they can't catalog is the intimacy. The way someone once sat with that body for hours, days, maybe weeks, wrapping, adjusting, painting, pausing to weep, then continuing again. That's not science. That's love, made into sculpture. She shapes the mouth just wide enough, not in agony, in reverence, so that the child's voice might still echo in the hut, so that memory has a shape, a ritualized version of yourself, shaped by those who loved you. There are mummies with cords or rods supporting the jaw, intentionally inserted. Not nightmares, just dreams where the mummies were there, sitting, watching, quiet. She said it felt like they were waiting for something, not impatient, just ... enduring. That's the word she used, enduring. Across millennia, through earthquakes and windstorms and careless digs, through the slow crawl of time and the dry silence of the Atacama, they endure. And when she would wake, she said she always remembered the mouths first, as though they were still breathing in her sleep. It's something more like awe, or awareness, like the body is listening even now, as though standing in the presence of the mummies makes you aware of your own face, your own breath, your own eventual stillness. You breathe in, and you realize how soft your skin is, how quiet your heart becomes when you listen closely. The mummy doesn't threaten. It just reminds. The open mouth is not a scream. It's an invitation. For memory, for continuity, for breath. Perhaps it was makeup, or ritual paint. Perhaps it meant something about the person's role. A storyteller, maybe, or a singer, or a guardian. The pigment might have emphasized the mouth's power as a channel, a vessel, a kind of relic. Over time, the meaning has eroded, but the impression remains. When you see the face, the emotion is immediate, even if you don't know why. Reeds and sticks and sinew once held the face just so, carefully, deliberately, repeatedly. Some mummies even show signs of the jaw being removed entirely and reattached. It wasn't an afterthought. It was an art. For the Chinchorro, death was a long collaboration. The body wasn't simply laid down and covered with earth. It was tended, reconstructed. In some cases, the body was completely disassembled after death. That void where a voice used to be. A gap in the middle of the face that says something, though we don't know what. In some ways, it might have been a way to resist forgetting. The living could look at the face of their ancestor and feel, for a moment, like they were still there, mid-sentence, mid-laugh, mid-lament. Flesh was removed, bones were cleaned, dried, even painted. The skull was sometimes replaced with a mask, a new face for a new phase of being. But in the world of the Chinchorro, death came home. Literally. Mummified relatives lived in the same space as the living, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. A child might grow up with the face of a dead uncle perched in the corner of the room. That mouth, always open, always just about to say something. Clay and ash and straw were added, reshaped, smoothed over with care. And when all of that was done, the mouth was still left open, as though it needed to remain unfinished. No two mummies are the same, but the motif returns again and again. It's hard to picture today. We hide our dead. We bury them in cemeteries, behind fences, beneath layers of euphemism and polished stone. There's a theory, a quiet one, rarely published but whispered among researchers, that the open mouths were left as doorways. You begin to realize, after studying enough of them, that it's not fear the faces express, at least not usually. Archaeologists often try to read these expressions in modern terms. But the truth is, the Chinchorro lived in a world utterly unlike ours. Sometimes they find pigments around the mouth, red ochre or black manganese. One researcher, after years of studying Chinchorro skulls, said she began dreaming of them. Others report something else. Not dreams, but a kind of pull. We often think of death as a closed door. But here, it was an opening. You can imagine the scene. A mother holds her child's skull, gently binding it, painting the face. Her hands are steady. When modern scientists catalog the mummies, they use numbers, grid systems, typologies. Chinchorro red type, Chinchorro black type, clay mask variant. And still, the mouths stay open. Not to haunt, but to remember. And to be remembered. It is an old desert, older than any road that winds through it, older than pyramids, older than bronze. In the northern reaches of Chile, where the sea meets the driest place on earth, the land remembers. It is to sink into a worldview that does not divide life from death as we do now. It is to see death not as an abrupt vanishing, but as a process of reshaping, of remaking. The Chinchorro did not simply preserve the dead. They transformed them, remolded their loved ones in the image of continuity. But theories have grown like desert moss around that silence. A way in, a way out, not literally, but spiritually. In many ancient traditions, the breath, the exhale, the final sigh is considered sacred. It is the release of the soul. So what would it mean to preserve that moment? To keep the mouth suspended in a permanent breath? Maybe the Chinchorro wanted to freeze that moment. Not the cold stillness of death, but the warm memory of a living face, caught mid-thought, forever reaching out toward you. Perhaps this is why the mouths don't look uniformly shaped. Some are more slack, others tense. Some seem to whisper, some almost laugh. The variety is too human to be accidental. And even then, the work of remembrance never ended. The dead stayed near. They attended the same ceremonies, marked the same seasons. Children grew up watching the still, open mouths of people they never met. Great-grandparents or distant ancestors. Visitors pause. Photographers linger. Scientists measure angles, count teeth, make sketches. One wonders what they'd discover if they tried it with the Chinchorro. What timbre might rise from those hollow mouths? What vowel, long buried in the clay, might surface again? But beyond the data lies something more timeless. A sense that these faces are not finished speaking, but through ritual and repetition, they came to know them all the same. It says, I was once here. I once spoke, laughed, cried, sang. And even now, some echo of that lingers. Of community. They stitched death back into the family so that love did not have to let go. The Chinchorro seemed to have chosen the opposite. Not closure, but openness. You can imagine, if you're quiet enough, that the wind carries the breath of those long-gone voices. That somewhere in that breeze, the open mouths are still participating, not haunting, just being, listening, speaking. That our dead don't vanish when they're loved into memory, into ritual, into story. The Chinchorro didn't draw a hard line between now and before. They held the past in their arms, painted its face, shaped its voice, and let it sit beside them, holding a place in the world of the living, not forgetting, but integrating, not silence, but suspended breath, where even the long dead take their place among the living, their presence not metaphorical, but literal. Perhaps one child might place a flower near the foot of a mummy, while another traces the contours of its cheek with their fingertip. Curious. The clay is cold, but the mouth is familiar. But with the Chinchorro, it's different. The dignity is there, yes, but it's a dignity that continues. A life not sealed, but softly extended. Their faces don't feel past tense. They feel mid-thought, mid-breath, mid-presence. Every day, he passes her as he prepares fish, or ties his sandals, or speaks to his grandchildren. Her face is always there, her mouth open, not in terror, but as if about to say something he's heard 1,000 times before. Maybe he speaks to her aloud, or maybe her presence is enough. Its memory is not loud or boastful. It is quiet, patient, and deep. They were brought out during ceremonies, paraded, displayed, spoken to. Some may have sat in homes. Others traveled. Perhaps the mouth had to be open so that the ancestor could receive offerings, hear prayers, taste the air again. They weren't gone. They were just transformed. And maybe that meant they still needed to eat in a spiritual sense, to be part of the breath and dust of the world they once walked. Here, the wind moves like a whisper through the sand. The rocks stay still. The bones stay still. But the mouths, they remain open. To understand the Chinchorro mummies is not just to study anatomy or rituals. And at the center of that transformation was the face. The face, even in stillness, speaks. It holds memory, personality, story. The Chinchorro must have understood this. The attention they gave to the faces of the dead, delicate claywork, the careful placement of reeds, the exact shaping of the eyes and mouth, tells us what mattered most. Even when the body was completely reconstructed, muscles replaced with sticks, skin peeled, and set aside, the mouth was left open, slightly, always in that frozen posture of near speech. No one knows exactly why. One suggests that the mouth was a kind of portal. Another theory leans toward performance. These mummies were not hidden away. And then there is the theory of memory. When someone we love dies, we often remember the way they looked when they spoke to us. A familiar tilt of the lips, a certain expression mid-sentence, the sound they made when surprised or thoughtful. Imagine a hut where an old man sits with his mother's mummy propped in the corner. What does that do to a community's sense of time? Of grief? When death is not a disappearance, but a change of shape, the mouths remind us. The dead are not entirely gone. In Chinchorro life, death was slow. It could take months to complete the mummification. There is something beautiful and a little uncanny about the idea of a family gathering where no one is left behind. And in this long continuity, the open mouths serve a purpose. Even today, when these mummies are exhumed from the sand, cleaned and stored in climate-controlled museum cases, their mouths still catch the eye. In recent years, some researchers have tried to digitally reconstruct the voices of ancient people based on skull shape and vocal tract modeling. But maybe the value isn't in recovering the literal sound. Maybe the open mouth is already telling us what it needs to. It says, don't forget. Modern burial practices are often about closure. We speak of finding peace, of letting go. And maybe that's what makes their mummies feel so alive, even now. You can look at a European mummy or an Egyptian pharaoh and feel the dignity of death, the finality, the sealing of a life lived. When the wind moves across the Atacama, it sometimes carries the sound of shifting sand, of dry reeds brushing together, of waves breaking on the far-off coast. There's a strange comfort in that. Not in the fantasy that death is reversible, but in the recognition that remembrance can be an act of presence. They left the mouths open. And maybe, just maybe, they left them open for us, so that we too would remember to listen. There's something tender, almost reverent, about the way the Chinchorro handled the dead. You begin to understand it more deeply when you notice the colors, not just in the skin, or the earth, or the faded textiles, but in the bodies themselves. A red mummy, painted in ochre made from iron-rich soil, its skin sometimes stripped and rebuilt with paste. A black one, coated in a sleek, matte layer of manganese or charcoal, sometimes sculpted over with clay. A white one, rarer and more ghost-like, covered in a thin coating of ash or sediment paste, their details softened to near abstraction. Instead of total disassembly, the body was eviscerated and dried but left mostly intact, less sculpted. The body wasn't always taken apart. Instead, a coating of white ash paste or clay was added directly, sometimes lightly shaping the surface, other times just veiling it. Dressed sometimes, repaired. Some mummies were clearly repainted, reclayed, years after death, like family heirlooms being maintained, or companions being cared for. The black ones had theirs. Why dismantle a body and rebuild it from sticks? Why sculpt a face from clay, only to cover it with manganese? But as they began to uncover more, to map the coastline, to trace the patterns across centuries, a different picture formed. Not always in direct connection to the Chinchorro, but in the same rhythm of thought that the past walks with you. That memory inhabits space, that faces long gone still deserve to be seen. This wasn't crude preservation. This was a form of art, of intimacy, of memory carried in layers. Maybe the black ones were guardians, or holders of knowledge. Maybe the red ones were celebrants, bearers of warmth. Maybe the white ones were dreamers, bridges to the unseen. We don't know, but they were marked for a reason that stayed even after language left. This wasn't ancestor worship in the formal, altered sense. It was something gentler. Co-residence, togetherness. The lines between alive and not alive were not so rigid here. But preservation wasn't just environmental. It was emotional, generational. The living didn't want to let go. They wanted the dead to remain. And maybe color helped them remain by marking them as specific, as loved, as part of the tapestry of the home. A kind of calm, ancient dignity. Not flashy, not grotesque, just presence. One painted layer after another, like the silence of centuries made visible. These mummies feel quieter, less stylized, more like whispers of people. Their features are softened, sometimes blurred. You can imagine them sitting in a shadowed hut, coated in light dust, barely distinguishable from the earth around them. Clay masks were sometimes molded onto the face. Wig-like structures were added to the head, human hair, sometimes the deceased's own, bound into something ceremonial. And they were painted with rich red ochre, like desert blood. The color may have symbolized vitality, or transformation, or heat, or maybe it was simply the color of memory for them. The red mummies often look more human, more expressive, more vivid in posture. These weren't decorative choices. They were patterns, rituals, part of a language that spoke only through preparation. They were painted in layers, painted in meaning. They weren't just preserved. They were transformed. They weren't choosing randomly. There was something deeply personal about each process. But that's what makes it harder to decode. There's no one-size ritual. Each mummy seems to tell its own story, its own relationship to the living, its own role in whatever came next. You don't go from black to red to white in a neat timeline. The flesh was removed. The bones were cleaned and dried. A child crawling past the mummy of his grandfather, his hand brushing a clay shoulder. A mother whispering her worries to a mummy while preparing fish. Dust settling equally on pots and preserved faces. The mummy not as an object of fear, but as a presence, quiet but involved. Part of the air, part of the life still unfolding. A frame was made, sticks for the spine, reeds to hold the limbs straight. The skull was cleaned, sometimes filled with ash or plant matter to hold its shape. The skin was reapplied, sometimes the person's own, sometimes animal hide or sea lion skin. Then a smooth layer of paste was molded over everything, and finally the entire surface was painted black. Not a deep funeral black, more like a reflective, velvety one. Manganese oxide made it shimmer faintly in the sun. The effect was stark, otherworldly. Not a corpse, not a statue, something between. Instead, the techniques overlap, interweave, fade out, and return again. It's a dance of cultural memory, shifting tastes, evolving belief. But the black mummies are generally the earliest. They appear around 5000 BCE, long before Egyptian dynasties took shape. And they were intricate. Red, black, and white. Not the colors of clothing or ornament, but of skin after death. The living reached across the final boundary, not with fire or burial, but with color. If you walked among the Chinchorro dead, you would not see sameness. You would see variety. Archaeologists have spent decades trying to decode this language. The patterns aren't chronological in a simple way. The black mummies were made with patience. The body was taken apart, piece by piece. Then came the red mummies. Their method changed. And then, quietly, the white mummies emerged. Simpler. The shifts between styles are not always clear. One family might have several mummies of different styles. A red uncle, a black grandmother, a white child. But one thing remains constant across the colors. These weren't burials. The dead stayed in the home. They sat in corners. They were propped up, cleaned. You can almost imagine it. This is perhaps why the colors mattered. They weren't mere aesthetics. They were identities. The red ones had their particular power. When archaeologists first began to find these mummies, they didn't understand. The colors confused them. The materials seemed primitive. The colors lasted because the desert preserved them. And so did the salt, the dryness, the windless air. Some modern descendants of the region still speak of the spirits of the ancestors. And there's something in the red, the black, the white, something that feels enduring. In the silence of the Atacama Desert, the past doesn't sleep. It lingers, quietly, not in crumbling temples or lost cities, but in the painted skin of the long dead, watching from beneath layers of clay, ash, and ochre. What they left behind were bodies, sculpted, assembled, curated, each one a message, if only you can learn to read it. And the messages were written not just in form, but in color. You find yourself wondering what it must have felt like to touch one of them. But for the Chinchorro, it was more than pigment. It was practice, a process. They are subtler. Their color doesn't announce itself. It mutes, softens. Made from volcanic ash or crushed bone, their pale coating turns them into ghost-like forms. Unlike the red and black mummies, these often lack facial features. Their contours are smooth, their eyes covered. They seem to fade slightly, even while being preserved. And perhaps that was the point. A different philosophy. Not all the dead needed to be vivid. They're social. Their preservation implies a social structure, a household rhythm that includes the dead, not in abstract worship, but in proximity. The dead weren't just honored. They were companions. The black manganese came from specific geological deposits, sometimes quite distant. The red ochre was chosen not just for color, but for texture and adherence. This suggests trade, exchange, a network of knowledge about materials, which in turn suggests that mummification wasn't just personal, accepting it not as an interruption, but a change in condition. The black is dense, the red still rich, the white haunting. Thousands of years have passed, but the pigment remains. The message remains, not in words, but in presence, in patience, in the choice to color the ones you couldn't bear to let go. The dead weren't removed from life, they were folded into it. The red ones, the black ones, the white ones, each one a chapter, not a conclusion. It was cultural. There was knowledge being passed. How to mix, how to coat, how to bind. Generations of hands refining the art. Some could simply withdraw, gently, into a new form of being. That's your black uncle, the hunter, a mother might whisper to her child. And this red one was your father's sister, the midwife. The colors became part of the oral tradition, a way to teach, to remember, to point. The black mummies, for instance, were not simply painted. They were reconstructed with blackness in mind. They overlapped. A black mummy might appear in a period dominated by reds. They are careful, symmetrical, thoughtful. Some are adorned with facial features molded from paste. Some have eyelids shaped with sticks or fibers. Others have little details, bracelets, beads, cloth fragments that suggest personality. They weren't trying to erase the person. They were trying to hold on to them, to anchor them through texture and tone in the space of the living. A red one might be painted in a community favoring whites. Most mummification traditions reserve such effort for leaders, warriors, elites. But the Chinchorro preserved infants, toddlers, even stillborns, sometimes more carefully than adults. This reveals something profound. That worth was not measured by achievement, but by connection, by love. A tiny baby, never able to speak, still mattered enough to be built from ash and clay and painted with care. The practice was fluid. It responded to family traditions, local resources, spiritual shifts. There was no orthodoxy, only continuity, only care. The ochre shines even now, millennia later. It was iron oxide, pulverized and mixed with some kind of binder, maybe fish oil, maybe plant sap. Sometimes you can see where a limb has broken and been reattached. This suggests not just ritual, but ongoing attention. The dead weren't simply mummified and then ignored. They were maintained. A grandmother dips a handmade brush into red pigment. Her hands are slow, practiced. She leans over the figure of her own mother, reapplying the paint along one arm, not for show, for presence, for memory. She hums as she works. Her children glance over, accustomed to the shape in the corner. To them, it's not strange. It's part of the room. part of the lineage, visited, perhaps even consulted. One body might pass through several hands over decades, and each hand left its mark, a new layer of pigment, a reinforcement of clay, a fresh band of fabric. The result was a pigment that soaked deep into the clay coatings and preserved skin, and it wasn't just slathered on. It was painted with care. Each coat of paint may have marked a moment. A flood survived, a birth celebrated, a loss endured. The mummy became a canvas for living memory, a kind of family diary in flesh and soil. Sometimes the face alone is red, sometimes the entire body, sometimes the hair, made from human strands or animal fibers, is dyed to match. The red mummies feel alive in a different way, not elemental, but vital, radiant. You imagine them as people who were cherished in a different light. Perhaps red was for the spirited, the admired, the beloved. The entire sequence, from removing the skin to building a new exoskeleton of reeds and ash paste, culminated in the final painting. That layer of black manganese wasn't just applied, it was earned. It sealed the process. It announced the transition. Not in the invasive way of modern excavation, but gently, as a daughter might straighten the shoulder of her mother's mummy, years after death. It's not death, not mourning. The Chinchorro didn't seem afraid of the dead. Instead, black might have meant origin, night sky, depth, the unknown, something powerful and containing. To paint the dead in black was perhaps to situate them in the realm of the sacred, the endless, the elemental. And yet, the black mummies are not hidden away. They sit, often quite openly. They become part of the visual life of the family. Black, then, might be a way of anchoring the sacred within the everyday. There's something ceremonial in the touch, yes, but also something domestic, familiar. As if the preservation of the dead wasn't an end, but a kind of continuing relationship, a different form of life. The Chinchorro, for all their elaborate mortuary practices, left no writing, no scrolls, no tablets, no engraved tombs. We often assume color is an aesthetic choice, a flourish added for effect. And what is black, really, in this context? The red mummies, by contrast, glow, and the white ones. These three color traditions didn't replace each other in strict sequence. Some archaeologists have noted that many mummies, especially black and red ones, show signs of repair. Cracks filled in, clay reapplied, paint refreshed. In this way, color also becomes chronology. Not in a clear, readable way, like rings in a tree, but in layers. You can picture it, a low room, stone-walled and dark, with desert light filtering in through a thatched roof. And as you sit with this image, you begin to realize something else. The Chinchorro mummies are not isolated relics, which makes the choice of color even more poignant. To live among the dead is to assign them identity, and the color may have spoken to that. When scientists studied some of the pigments, they found remarkable consistency, and it was art. That becomes clear the longer you look. The mummies are not grotesque. It's worth noting, too, that many of the earliest mummies are children. This isn't typical in many ancient cultures. And those colors, so stark, so persistent, remind us that this wasn't a people obsessed with death. It was a people in conversation with it. Even today, you can feel it, standing in a museum or at a dig site. The colors still cling. The desert wind seems endless. It doesn't howl, not here. It breathes, soft and constant, as if the sky itself is exhaling in long, shallow sighs. And beneath that breath, the sand shifts. Tiny particles of time rearranged. You would hardly notice it if you weren't looking, but the landscape of the Atacama is always adjusting, delicately, imperceptibly, as if it were still trying to hide something, or protect something. These were not the first to die. Death had been occurring all along, but these were the first to be transformed in this particular way. The red mummies, so named because of the vivid ochre pigment that was applied to their skin, were a response to something that had already been felt for generations, that the dead were still family, still present, still requiring care. These wigs were long, dark, and often held in place with clay. In some, the lips were sewn shut with thread or thorns, a feature that stood in contrast to the wide, open mouths of others. Or perhaps concealment, a way to blend the dead with the shadows of the landscape. It is possible that black meant death, but it is just as possible that black meant presence, a form of dark permanence. Not all red mummies scream. Some are quiet, silently wrapped in pigment and hair and patience, buried not deep but deliberately, anchored in the earth by the ritual of care. One phase gave way to the next, not with a rupture, but with a gentle drift. Some bodies were painted black and red. Some had layers of color, suggesting ritual elaboration over time. The ritual was not static. It breathed. It grew. Some say these acts were part of ancestor veneration, that the mummies were kept in homes, brought out during ceremonies, dressed and redressed like aging children. Others suggest they were tokens of status, the care one could afford to give to the dead. Some believe they were meant to linger with the living for as long as the bodies could physically endure, not just remembered, but materially here. The method here was slightly different. They began with evisceration, but instead of simply painting the restored skin, they coated the entire body with black manganese, and had no pottery, placed more effort and time into their dead than any known group of their time. They were not waiting to be buried in pyramids. They were not following rulers. The air is too damp. It is what they practiced. And the practice was this: to take death and turn it back into form, to reassemble it, to color it, to give it a place in the room. The light too harsh, but in the desert, their paint held fast. Their wigs remained curled. Their pigments clung like memory to skin. They were fishers and gatherers, children and elders, living on the edge of the driest desert on earth. And they turned the act of death into an art form of tenderness. Sometimes charcoal, but mostly manganese, a dark mineral that turned their forms into silhouettes of the living, still with wigs, still with bone and ash, but now painted in the color of the void. There, resting with their eyes hollow and mouths open, are the red ones, the black ones, the white ones. Red forms, black outlines, white fragments. They lie in lines or groups, sometimes alone, sometimes stacked in bundles. Instead, the dead were interred in the same sand as the living walked upon, some beneath homes, some beside hearths, some under open sky. They were near, they were known, and around them, traces of pigment remain on the earth, as if the desert itself once wore their colors, not with fear, but familiarity, or the way a family might pause to brush sand from a blackened face as they tended the fire. The living and the dead shared time, shared weather, shared air. Some were more rudimentary, missing limbs, or patched with fragments of animal bone, but still they were decorated, not disposed of, still honored, still placed within reach, sourced from nearby hills or riverbeds, crushed to powder, mixed with fat, and brushed on. The red was not just a color. Some stand upright, their heads tilted slightly back as if gazing at something far off. Their limbs are symmetrical, their surfaces carefully polished, and the faces, long, still, expressionless, look neither asleep nor awake. They simply are. It was the heat of living blood remembered. It was perhaps a way to say, you are not gone, you are not cold, you are not forgotten. More experimental. Their bodies were covered in a white ash or clay paste. Sometimes this coating cracked, like dried riverbed earth. Sometimes it flaked. It looked like statues, or ghosts, or things between. The white wasn't applied only as a color, but as texture, building thickness, density, weight. The dead that look like they've stayed awake far too long, the ones who linger. And today, In this part of their story, we sit with the colors. To speak of the Chinchorro mummies without speaking of color is to miss the way the dead were once painted, not as decoration, not merely, but as part of something much older than metaphor. Color here is material and memory. It doesn't symbolize the soul. It clothes it. The first among them, archaeologists say, were the red ones. It sounds harsh when spoken plainly, but the tone of the act was not violence. It was gentleness in disassembly. Limbs would be removed, bones cleaned, skin carefully peeled away. The insides, which decomposed quickly, were removed and replaced with sticks, or ash, or wool. The body was rebuilt from within, shaped again like something sacred being reassembled. And when it had been pieced back together, sewn, padded, supported, it was painted. They would begin by taking the body apart. A thick coat of red mineral pigment was applied to the skin. Hematite, iron oxide. The heads were reconstructed with wigs, hair from the living, offered like a thread from life to death. Later came the black mummies, not a replacement, but a shift. A different language in the same ritual grammar. And if red was warmth, black might have been the color of continuity. There is an elegance to the black mummies. They are smoother, more sculpted. Later still came the white mummies. They are rarer. Some of the white mummies had black painted heads, making their faces emerge like masks out of a pale body. Over time, the techniques changed, but the gestures remained familiar. And what was the purpose of all this? There are many theories. Anthropologists speculate. Whatever the reason, what lingers in the archaeological record is this: the Chinchorro people, who were pre-agricultural. To walk through the remains now, when archaeologists allow it, is to pass through a palette of time. There are no walls around most Chinchorro burials, no grand sarcophagi or tombs. You can imagine, perhaps, the way a child might play beside a mother's painted remains. And the desert, so quiet, so dry, kept them. In modern museums, these mummies often lose their color. It is not just what they believed about the dead that matters. Not hidden, not gone, just different now. Out in the Atacama, the light falls thin and hard. A glassy light, too old and too clean to feel warm. You might find yourself squinting, even in the early morning, your feet crunching over pale ground that's never known soft grass or running water. If you knelt there, brushing aside the whisper-thin sand, you might uncover what looks like burnt driftwood. Around 5000 BCE, their creation began with disassembly, the slow removal of skin, organs, muscles. A small incision was made to remove the organs, but the skin remained, coated in a vivid red ochre. They were painted in ash or in kaolin clay, pale and soft and ghost-like, as if memory had begun to slip but was not yet gone. They had no specific chronology, no clear system. They were exceptions. And in some ways, it has. No one speaks Chinchorro anymore. In some Andean highland villages, families still repaint the skulls of ancestors. A body wrapped in white, but with ochre dots like freckles on the chest. There were no rules. Or rather, the rules shifted, changed with each person, each family, each painter. No pyramids, no kings, just pigment and patience, just family and salt wind. The red ones, the black ones, the white ones. None of them screaming, all of them listening. That's why we find them so human. Not because they look like us, but because they were treated like us, with variation, with memory, with longing. In others, white powder is used to bless both the dead and the crops. Behind glass, they seem frozen, but you know better now. You know they were not always still, that they moved between homes, that they watched harvests, that they were included in dreams. Their faces may seem haunting, but they are only asking to be remembered, not by name, but by gesture, by hue. The red that bled through centuries, the black that refused to fade. The white that softened over time. Color as continuity. Not spectacle. Just a whisper of presence. The red ones, the black ones, the white ones, they weren't categories. They were voices. They were choices made in silence. Grief expressed not in tears, but in clay. Their language, whatever it sounded like, left no writing behind. No myths, no songs on papyrus. Just pigment, just posture, just silence. And yet the color remains. Anthropologists still debate its purpose, its order, its meaning. But the real message might not be in the mummies themselves. It might be in the care, the evidence of time spent, the persistence of ritual even when no one was watching. The paint, it seems, was never for us. It was for them. And maybe that's why it still moves us. And maybe that was the point. Death, like grief, rarely follows rules. Sometimes white meant purity. Sometimes it meant absence. Sometimes it was simply what was available that day, near the mouth of the river or in the pack of the healer's child. The mouth was sewn shut. The eyes were masked or left hollow. Some bore marks of trauma, as if death had come quickly and harshly, but the paint covered that. Red for protection, perhaps. Red for the blood that must not flow anymore. Red for the soul's transition, or its retention. No one truly knows. But there is a quiet heartbreak in the red, not angry, but unresolved. The body was reduced to a skeleton and then lovingly rebuilt, like a house taken apart and made whole again. Reeds and sticks braced the frame. Clay sealed joints. The face was smoothed into a mask of black manganese. A mother whispering as her fingers pressed ochre into a child's forehead. It suggests that the process of painting was not isolated. It was part of life. Maybe children learned to mix pigment before they could walk. Maybe people left red marks on rocks as they waited for the bodies to dry in the desert air. Maybe painting the dead meant learning to paint the world. The color wasn't just a surface. It was memory, laid down in layers, each brush a sentence. A son steadying his father's wrapped legs, trying to keep the posture upright. These were not burials. These were not endings. They were reinforcements of presence, a kind of second birth. The dead weren't stored. They were visited, moved, held. In some households, they sat in corners. In others, they lay beneath sleeping mats. Their colors, once brilliant, softened under the dust and sun, but they remained. They always remained. And a wig of human hair, sometimes long and flowing, sometimes cropped, crowned the top. When you looked at a black mummy, you weren't seeing a corpse. You were seeing a sculpture of life, painstakingly constructed to outlast what it represented. But look closer, and you'll see the careful shaping, the cut of jawbones, the crimp of fabric, the soft remains of something once meant to be sacred. Red ones, black ones, white ones, each stiff with intention, painted not for beauty, but for presence. You wouldn't be the first to crouch over them and wonder, what did this mean, and what do we carry forward when our answers are guesses stitched together by fragments? Anthropologists once tried to sort the Chinchorro mummies like books on a shelf. The red mummies belonged to one chapter, the black mummies to another. And for a while, that neat division helped. Red mummies were newer, they said, more advanced, maybe. Black mummies were older, more elaborate, perhaps, but simpler in spiritual terms. It was a clean system, the kind that makes museum placards easy to read. But in truth, the paint didn't speak in centuries. It spoke in emotion, in ritual, in whatever materials could be found nearby. Color was not always about time. It was about grief, about gesture, about doing what one could in a world too dry to decay and too dry to forget. The black mummies were the first, at least in form. Later, the red mummies arrived. Their process was less invasive. The body stayed more intact. And then came the less common ones, the white mummies. You can imagine the moment of painting. A family crouched over the body of someone they still talk to. In some archaeological finds, bits of red paint were discovered far from the mummies themselves, flakes caught in ancient windbreaks, or embedded in fire-hardened clay. You might expect, after so many centuries, that the meaning of these colors would fade. There are modern parallels, faint echoes in other coastal communities, rituals of color and death that linger despite time. Even now, researchers find new combinations. A mummy painted red, but with black hands. If you stood beside them today, in the Museo Arqueológico San Miguel de Izapa, perhaps you might feel the quiet crowd of colors watching back. There's a humility to their survival. Science finds them. Tourism spoils them. Out in the coastal desert of northern Chile, time moves in odd directions. It doesn't only march forward here, it also circles back. But if you sit long enough, if the wind strips the sand from one more ridge or carries away one more layer of time, you'll see it. A thin strip of red cloth poking out of the ground. They did not rest in tombs or lie behind stone walls. They remained close, often inside the homes of their descendants, or bundled in corners of communal shelters, always watching. While the pyramids of Egypt and the tombs of China drew awe and wonder, these mummies remained largely unknown. But slowly, things began to change. Scholars returned. New research was published. The idea that the world's earliest known mummification practices, predating even the Egyptians, came not from a grand civilization. The climate-controlled cases help, but they cannot undo what's already been lost. They are caught between protection and exposure, education and exploitation. The Chinchorro culture no longer exists as a living group, but their genetic legacy survives in some of the region's current inhabitants. For them, the mummies are not exhibits, they are family. Why the mummies, with their open mouths and painted skin, were meant to be watched only by those who knew how to look. And sometimes, when the wind rises just right, it covers over the footprints and reminds us what it means to wait. In the world they came from, seeing was an act of care. Now, too often, it is an act of consumption. Descendants have spoken out against the public display of their ancestors. They argue that these bodies should not be gawked at, that their resting places should not be cataloged like items in a warehouse. They remember the traditions passed down in whispered fragments, stories of how the dead remained close and were treated with care. That legacy, they say, is not compatible with glass cases and flashing cameras. Some argue that the mummies should be reburied, returned to the earth that sustained them for so long. Others believe that to bury them again is to erase the knowledge they carry, knowledge about health, diet, climate, and culture. The mummies speak not only of death, but of adaptation, of how a people survived in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Their bones hold data, their wrappings record choices. Every incision, every pigment, every posture tells a story. But can those stories be preserved without violating the dignity of those who once lived them? Some of the oldest mummies, over 7,000 years old, are beginning to deteriorate faster than anyone predicted. Mold, once rare in the arid desert, has begun to appear on some specimens. And protection, but also, inevitably, more attention. It is a double-edged sword. To preserve, one must expose. And exposure, even with the best intentions, brings risk. There is no easy answer. Just a long, slow negotiation between past and present, silence and storytelling, reverence and curiosity. The ancient skins, treated with ochre and resin long ago, are now reacting to modern air. And all the while, the pressure to display these remains, to draw visitors, to satisfy curiosity, to prove their importance to the world, continues. But from humble fisherfolk on the edge of the Atacama, challenged many assumptions. And with that discovery came attention. They weren't hidden from view. They were part of life. The desert itself became a kind of open-air gallery, though no one had asked permission to turn it into one. Others take fragments, a bone, a scrap of cloth. unaware of the damage they cause. Even a single breath can be harmful. These mummies, so incredibly old, are vulnerable to shifts in temperature, to changes in humidity, even to the oils on human skin. The open mouths that once startled early archaeologists now seem to whisper disapproval. Some of the damage is subtle, a slow erosion of pigment, a drying of fragile fibers, but some is more stark. Once distinct facial features crumble, wrappings fall apart. And because many of the mummies were not buried deep or protected by chambers, even the mildest disruption can have long-term consequences. Tourists began arriving, eager to see the screaming mummies for themselves. Some came with genuine curiosity. Others came for the spectacle. Local guides, pressured by demand and often underpaid, brought people close to burial sites without proper infrastructure or oversight. And the desert, which had so long protected its dead through silence, began to speak, mostly in warning. Death was not a separation, but a transition into another form of presence. Their bodies, carefully constructed with black clay or layered with red pigment, were meant to last. But the world they were built for is fading. The curve of a skull dulled by centuries of wind, the frayed end of a reed mat where someone once lay their loved one to rest. The preservation was astonishing. The skin stretched tight over armatures of cane and ash. The hair still thick and dark. The mouths forever open, as though they had something to say, or were caught mid-breath. But these early excavations were not always delicate. Many were rushed. Bodies were uprooted from the earth and carried off to faraway museums, sometimes without proper documentation, without full understanding, without the reverence that had once guided their care. In some cases, grave sites were looted not for science, but for profit. Skulls were sold, artifacts vanished. The bones of children were boxed up and shipped overseas. Some locals still know the places to avoid. Others, often newer to the region, do not. And as interest in these ancient burial sites grows, so too does the danger, not just to the mummies, but to the delicate quiet that once protected them. It drifts sideways, like the mist that creeps in from the Pacific each morning, ghosting over the sand before vanishing again. Out here, the desert is not empty. It is filled with memory, brittle, sun-bleached, and sometimes still staring back. When you walk across this land, you're never alone. You step where thousands once stepped, and just beneath the dust, sometimes only inches down, lie the remains of those who once lived here and those who are never meant to be disturbed. You might not notice them at first. The desert has a way of hiding its dead in plain sight. For generations, the Chinchorro mummies had been the guardians of their desert. When European archaeologists first began to dig in the region in the early 20th century, they weren't entirely sure what they had found. For decades, the Chinchorro people were mostly absent from global historical consciousness. Documentaries were made, photos circulated. The word Chinchorro began to appear in museum displays and academic lectures. The problem is not simply that tourists visit, it's how. Some walk directly on burial sites, not recognizing the signs. Local museums, like the one in Arica, now struggle to preserve what remains. Staff there speak quietly about the challenges. Behind the scenes, curators and scientists walk a tightrope. There is also the question of ownership. Who gets to decide what happens to these bodies? International bodies like UNESCO have taken note. Efforts are underway to recognize the Chinchorro sites as World Heritage locations, which could bring funding. As you sit with this history, quiet, strange, fragile, you might begin to understand why the desert once kept its secrets. But even so, the desert endures. It watches back. Its dunes shift. Its bones breathe dust. The first time a child stumbled upon a mummy in the Atacama, we'll never know what was said. Perhaps they called for their mother. Perhaps they stood still, staring, unsure if the figure half-curled in the sand was asleep or watching. To live near these coastal sands in northern Chile is to walk atop layers of human history that rise and fall with the wind. Scientists scribbled notes as the skin, once dyed red with ochre and stitched in place by a grieving hand, flaked beneath their breath. Visitors stood behind glass, mouths pressed to the surface, whispering about the open mouths, the vacant sockets. Local pride grew. Museums sprung up in Arica, then in Iquique. Regional governments began issuing glossy brochures. Archaeological sites were fenced, guarded, labeled. Visitors leaned close to open burial pits, snapping pictures, chatting, chewing gum, pointing. The arid air that once dried out the skin now mingles with human breath and carbon dioxide. The salt content in the ground, once stable, shifts as more feet pass through. Climate change plays its part too. When something ancient is dug up and paraded before the public, it's easy to forget that the descendants of the dead still walk among us. A group of community elders had raised concerns that the mummies were not being stored properly, that the lighting was too strong, the air too humid. There was even talk of spirits being disturbed. Rather than ridicule, the museum responded with a rare gesture. They paused, they adjusted, they consulted. It was a small thing, but a meaningful one. The beginning of a new approach, slower and more humane. The Chinchorro were fishers, net weavers, bone carvers, and their blood, however diluted, still flows in many locals today. That every gust of wind carries the breath of something old and watching. You may visit a museum and see a painted face beneath glass, mouth open, eyes absent, skin dark as rust. You may feel the weight of being seen, not by the living, but by the still. Some scholars argue for reburial with documentation. The idea that once studied, the mummies should be returned to rest with dignity and care. Others call for sacred display, where the presentation is not scientific but spiritual, where visitors are reminded they are in the presence of the dead, not artifacts, not objects, people. Yet few feel they have a say in how their ancestors are displayed. And even with the best intentions, it's hard to reconcile reverence with curiosity, preservation with access. It's hard to strike the right balance between remembering and disturbing. The dead are treated as specimens, as public treasures, but not necessarily as kin. This disconnection creates quiet fractures between heritage and spectacle. The scientists, the tourists, the descendants, or the land itself, which held these bodies quietly for so long, offering no judgment, only shelter. The Atacama was always dry, one of the driest places on Earth, but even subtle changes in humidity can turn fragile mummies to dust. Bodies that survived 5,000 years can crumble in 5 weeks if handled improperly. Not a scream, as some have imagined, but a sigh, long, dry, ancient. The sigh of a desert losing its quiet. The sigh of a people finally noticed, but never truly heard. The mummies, once carefully arranged in family groups, buried beneath homes, their faces painted with care, now lay, flattened by exposure bleached, and sometimes cracked from the fluctuating temperatures and careless footsteps of those who wandered too close. A tourist standing on the dusty outskirts of town could now follow a map that promised glimpses into a people thousands of years gone, whose rituals left behind more preserved bodies than the pharaohs. And as always happens, someone saw the money in it. Flashbulbs lit up faces that had once been arranged by families, possibly kissed, certainly mourned. Now, those same faces were dissected by strangers with cameras, standing in air-conditioned galleries far from the whispering Atacama dunes. Every fold of preserved tissue was charted, every bone alignment measured. They speak with a kind of reluctance about how things have changed, not because they resent knowledge or visitors, but because something has been lost. Reverence, maybe, or distance, or silence. And while their intent may have been academic, the result was not peace. It was exposure. The dead were opened, described, and displayed. For centuries, bones have surfaced slowly and without fanfare. No dramatic uncovering, no grand expedition. Just the faint hush of the desert, pulling aside its veil to reveal a sliver of ancient flesh, darkened and cracked like driftwood. Long before science named them, locals lived with the mummies quietly, almost shyly. They were not artifacts, they were just there, like the rocks, like the wind. But the mummies did not stay still forever. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists from Europe and North America began turning their gaze to the southern deserts. And when word reached their ears that bodies older than Egypt's lay in Chile, in a desert where preservation happened not through human magic, but through dryness alone, it sparked the predictable flurry of academic interest, followed, as it always is, by commercial greed. The scientific world called it a breakthrough. The mummies had a name now, the Chinchorro, and they were suddenly cast in the museum light. No longer companions of the sand, they became items for study, for comparison, for marveling. Imagine, if you will, a mummy carried from its resting place on a shoreline hill, its bindings loosened, its painted face scrutinized under bright lab lamps. One mummy traveled to Paris, another to New York. Some made it as far as Sydney. And yet, the strangest part of this modern entanglement is how slowly, and almost unknowingly, the Chinchorro mummies became celebrities. By the 2000s, you could take a guided Chinchorro tour with optional hotel pickup, with stops at burial sites, a boxed lunch, and a complimentary pamphlet. The truth is, the desert preserved them, but modernity unwrapped them. In Arica, there are still those who remember when the mummies were simply part of the land. Some elders recall their grandparents finding femurs in riverbeds. And there is another complication. Not long ago, a small museum in Chile decided to close one of its exhibitions. In recent years, there's been growing pressure to reframe how we treat the mummies. But the debate is far from settled. Funding for tourism often outweighs the ethical concerns. Museums rely on mummies to draw crowds. So the question hangs, like the wind over the sand. Who owns the past? If you ever find yourself in northern Chile, walking the edges of the desert, you may feel it. That subtle awareness that the ground beneath you remembers more than it reveals. And if you pause, if you take a step back and close your eyes, you might hear something beneath the silence. The desert wind is constant here, as if the earth is breathing quietly beneath an endless sky. This wind, soft and relentless, carries the dust of centuries' fragments of forgotten lives, broken pots, and most poignantly, the remnants of the Chinchorro people. The sand hides their secrets, but it also reveals them in small whispers, if you know where and how to listen. Walking paths have been laid near archaeological sites, but not all visitors heed the boundaries. The moisture from breath, fluctuations in temperature due to increased foot traffic. For the Chinchorro people, death was not an end, but a transformation. The mummification process was an intimate act, entwining the dead with the living community. Community leaders collaborate with archaeologists to develop respectful guidelines for site visits. There is a growing movement to balance the desire for knowledge and access with the imperative to protect and honor. This balance is delicate and ongoing. Families cared for the mummies, keeping them close as reminders of continuity and memory. But tourism often reduces this profound cultural practice to spectacle. The mummies become curiosities, photographed, stared at, sometimes gawked at without understanding. This shift from reverence to entertainment risks eroding the cultural significance, embedded in every painted face and stitched limb. And even the carbon dioxide exhaled by visitors can contribute to the decay of organic material preserved for thousands of years. They have called for greater respect and involvement in decisions regarding the preservation and presentation of the mummies. For many, the mummies are not relics, but relatives, deserving of dignity and protection beyond the demands of tourism and science. Museums have responded by installing climate control and limiting access. But these measures are not always enough, especially for mummies still buried or exposed outdoors. Inadvertent steps on fragile burial grounds can cause irreparable damage. The Chinchorro mummies are ancient, yet their story is living and evolving. Preservation is not merely about keeping bones intact, but about sustaining memory and respect across millennia. It requires patience, humility, and a willingness to listen, not just to scientific data, but to the voices of those connected by blood and land. The sand, which once acted as a protective blanket, now bears the weight of countless feet, accelerating erosion and the disintegration of delicate bones and wrappings. Their painted faces catch the fading light, a testament to human care and the enduring bonds between the living and the dead. They remind us that history is not just what we find buried in sand, but what we choose to remember and protect in the present. The very act of looking becomes complicated, a desire to witness history balanced against the risk of destroying it. The mummies, once silent witnesses to an ancient way of life, now find themselves caught between two worlds, the past that shaped them and the present that seeks to define them. With the rise of tourism in northern Chile, the Chinchorro mummies have become a paradox. Revered by scientists and historians, yet endangered by the very attention they receive. The influx of visitors eager to witness these ancient remains has transformed the desert into a fragile stage, where the past is both displayed and disrupted. The mummies, once wrapped carefully and kept close to home by their families, now lie exposed, some behind glass in controlled environments, others vulnerable in the open desert to the elements and human interference. One of the greatest threats is the physical toll of tourism. Additionally, the mummies are vulnerable to changes in microclimate caused by human presence. Beyond physical harm, there is a deeper, more intangible consequence: the loss of sacredness. Local communities have voiced concerns about this. Descendants of the region, who carry genetic and cultural ties to the Chinchorro, often feel alienated from how their ancestors are represented. Efforts have been made to address these concerns. Some museums have introduced educational programs to teach visitors about the cultural and spiritual importance of the mummies. In the backdrop of these challenges lies the question of time itself. As the sun sets over the Atacama, casting long shadows across the desert floor, the mummies rest once more. The desert around the ancient Chinchorro burial sites seems endless. Its silence is deep, not empty, but filled with the quiet presence of countless years. Here, beneath a sky that stretches far beyond the edges of sight, time has folded and unfolded in gentle waves, carrying stories of those who came before us. The mummies of the Chinchorro people rest in this vast landscape, silent witnesses painted in red, black, and white. Their painted faces, carefully reconstructed limbs, and open mouths tell a story that bridges millennia, even as the world around them changes. In recent decades, the story of the Chinchorro mummies has entered a new chapter, one of tension, hope, and reflection. That some things must be allowed to endure in their own time, shielded from the rush of modern life. Many come quietly, with respect. Others less so, sometimes unintentionally causing harm by stepping beyond paths or touching fragile remains. Education efforts grow, teaching visitors that the desert and its dead are not a playground, but a sacred archive. The red, black, and white figures rest once more in quiet dignity. They are no longer screaming. They are waiting, watching, remembering. And through them, we glimpse not only death, but the enduring thread of human care, the willingness to hold on to memory, even when the voices grow faint. That the stories of the Chinchorro mummies are not only about death, but about continuity, about how the past can remain present when treated with reverence. Their painted eyes, though hollow, seem to ask how we will remember them. Will we protect their legacy? Will we listen to the stories the desert holds? Will we treat the dead with the same care their creators did thousands of years ago? Scientific discovery, the thirst for knowledge, and the draw of tourism have combined to shine a brighter light on these ancient remains than ever before. New preservation techniques are tested in laboratories and desert museums, aiming to stabilize pigments that have held their color for thousands of years, and to conserve fragile fibers that once formed hair wigs. Controlled environments, with carefully monitored humidity and temperature, protect some of the most delicate mummies, offering them a safe place to rest in a modern world that is so different from the one that bore them. Yet, with that illumination comes complexity: how to protect what is fragile, how to honor what is sacred, how to balance curiosity with care. Descendants and local indigenous groups are increasingly involved in decisions about how the mummies are displayed and treated. Their voices carry stories passed down through generations, stories of respect, of mourning, of connection. These perspectives challenge the purely scientific narrative and remind us that the dead were once living people, loved and remembered. They call for exhibitions that do not merely present mummies as relics, but that honor their place in a living tradition of remembrance. Across the Atacama, local communities and scientists have begun working together to navigate these challenges. But preservation is not only physical, it is cultural. The desert, too, offers lessons. It reminds us that patience is essential. Tourism continues, of course. Visitors arrive, eager to see the screaming mummies, to glimpse the uncanny faces preserved by time. There is an almost poetic cycle at work. The mummies, created to watch over the living, now watch us. In the fading light, as stars begin to prick the sky, the desert exhales. And if you are still listening later, I'd love to know what part stayed with you. This is Deep History for Sleepers.